Tonight, we are not talking about a new gun law being passed. We are not talking about a nationwide firearm ban. And we are not talking about a Supreme Court ruling that suddenly changed the Constitution overnight. What we are talking about tonight is something far more subtle, and far more important for lawful gun owners to understand. Because earlier this week, the United States Supreme Court quietly denied reconsideration in a firearm confiscation case that many legal analysts had been watching closely. There was no press conference. No oral arguments. No dramatic split decision. Just a single procedural action, and yet, the implications of that action are already being debated across legal circles, advocacy groups, and law enforcement agencies. Before we go any further, if you care about staying informed on real court decisions, verified legal updates, and how constitutional rights are being interpreted in the courts, make sure you subscribe to this channel now. That way, you don't miss important updates that rarely get clear coverage in mainstream media. This video is for informational and educational purposes only and does not provide legal advice. Laws and court decisions can vary by jurisdiction, so always consult a qualified attorney for guidance specific to your situation. Now, let's carefully break down what actually happened. The Supreme Court's decision here was not a ruling on guilt or innocence. It was not a judgment declaring a practice constitutional or unconstitutional. Instead, it was a denial of a request asking the court to revisit a lower court decision. That distinction matters a lot. Every year, the Supreme Court receives thousands of petitions asking it to review lower court rulings. The court accepts only a small percentage of those cases. When the court declines to hear a case, it does not necessarily mean the justices agree with the outcome below. It simply means the court has chosen not to intervene at this time. In this particular case, the underlying dispute involved the temporary confiscation of firearms following a mental health-related incident, even though no criminal charges were filed and no judge issued a traditional search or seizure warrant. The individual at the center of the case legally owned his firearms. He held a valid license. He had no criminal history. And according to medical evaluations referenced in court filings, he was eventually cleared for release. Despite that, his firearms were taken and retained under a public safety rationale that did not involve a criminal prosecution. That is where the legal controversy begins. Several years ago, the Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision in a separate case making clear that the home holds the highest level of Fourth Amendment protection, and that generalized public safety concerns do not automatically justify warrantless entry or seizure inside a person's residence. That ruling was widely viewed as reinforcing limits on how far law enforcement can go without judicial oversight. So when this newer case worked its way through the lower courts, many observers expected that earlier Supreme Court precedent to play a central role. Instead, the appellate court upheld the actions taken by authorities using a different legal framework, one focused on what courts refer to as special needs, rather than traditional law enforcement searches. The petitioners then asked the Supreme Court to step in, arguing that the lower court had effectively sidestepped binding precedent by relying on labels rather than substance. This week, the Supreme Court declined to do so. Again, that denial does not establish a new constitutional rule. It does not authorize firearm confiscation nationwide. And it does not overturn the court's earlier unanimous decision. But it does leave the lower court's ruling in place within that specific jurisdiction. And that is why this case is generating concern, not because of what the Supreme Court said, but because of what it chose not to say. In the next part of this breakdown, we'll look at what a denial of reconsideration legally means, how lower courts interpret that silence, and why gun rights advocates and legal scholars are paying close attention to how this reasoning could be applied in future cases. To understand why this Supreme Court denial matters, we need to be very clear about what a denial of reconsideration actually does, and just as importantly, what it does not do. When the Supreme Court declines to revisit a case, it does not create new law. It does not rewrite constitutional standards. And it does not automatically approve the reasoning used by the lower court. However, what it does do is allow the lower court's ruling to remain in effect within that specific federal circuit. That distinction is critical. In this case, the appellate court relied on a legal theory often referred to as the special needs doctrine. This doctrine allows certain government actions without a traditional warrant when officials argue that the purpose is not criminal enforcement, but rather public safety or administrative necessity. Historically, this doctrine has been used in limited contexts, such as checkpoints, regulatory inspections, or narrowly defined emergency situations. It was never designed as a broad substitute for the Fourth Amendment's warrant requirement inside the home. The legal controversy here arises because the earlier unanimous Supreme Court decision made it very clear that the home receives the highest level of constitutional protection. That ruling emphasized that exceptions to the warrant requirement must remain narrow and cannot be expanded simply by relabeling their purpose. Critics of the appellate court's ruling argue that this is exactly what happened. The underlying facts involved law enforcement entering a private residence and seizing lawfully owned firearms without a judicial warrant. The justification, however, was framed as a non-criminal public safety measure rather than traditional law enforcement action. By treating these two frameworks as legally distinct, the lower court avoided directly applying the Supreme Court's earlier precedent. That is why legal scholars describe this case as less about firearms themselves and more about constitutional structure. If courts are permitted to bypass binding precedent by changing terminology, community caretaking, special needs, emergency aid, the practical protection of the Fourth Amendment becomes inconsistent. Supporters of the lower court's decision argue that public safety situations involving mental health require flexibility. They point out that courts must balance individual rights with the responsibility to prevent harm, even in cases where no crime has been committed. Opponents counter that flexibility without judicial oversight invites abuse. They warn that once warrantless seizure is normalized under broad public safety language, the burden shifts from the government proving necessity to citizens proving innocence. The Supreme Court's refusal to reconsider the case does not resolve that debate. Instead, it leaves the issue unsettled at the national level while allowing the appellate court's interpretation to guide future cases within its jurisdiction. This is why advocacy groups on both sides are closely watching how lower courts and law enforcement agencies respond. Not because a new rule was announced, but because silence at the top can still shape behavior below. In the final section, we'll examine what this means in practical terms for lawful gun owners, why constitutional protections may now differ by region, and what legal experts say should happen next. So what does this actually mean going forward, not in theory, but in real life? The most immediate impact of the Supreme Court's denial is geographic inconsistency. Because the court did not step in, the appellate ruling remains controlling law only within that federal circuit. That means constitutional protections related to warrantless firearm seizures can now differ depending on where a person lives. In practical terms, two lawful gun owners with identical circumstances could face very different outcomes solely based on jurisdiction. One may benefit from stricter warrant requirements, while another may be subject to broader public safety-based seizures without prior judicial approval. This fragmentation is something the Supreme Court has historically tried to avoid, especially on constitutional questions. Uniform interpretation is supposed to be one of the court's core functions. That is why many legal observers were surprised by the decision not to reconsider the case. It's also important to clarify what this ruling does not authorize. It does not allow random firearm confiscations. It does not eliminate the Fourth Amendment. And it does not remove all due process protections. What it does is leave unresolved how far certain exceptions can extend when public safety is cited, particularly in situations involving mental health evaluations where no crime has been committed and no warrant has been issued. That unresolved space is where concern exists. Civil liberties attorneys warn that once courts permit exceptions to expand without clear limits, enforcement standards can gradually loosen. Law enforcement agencies, acting in good faith, may rely on broader interpretations that later courts are hesitant to rein in. On the other side, public safety advocates argue that these tools are necessary to respond quickly to situations that don't fit neatly into criminal law frameworks. They stress that delayed action can sometimes carry serious risks. Both arguments exist simultaneously, and the Supreme Court's silence effectively leaves that balance to lower courts for now. For lawful gun owners, the takeaway is not panic, it's awareness. Knowing your local laws, understanding how courts in your circuit interpret warrant requirements, and recognizing that constitutional protections can be applied differently across jurisdictions has become more important than ever. For policymakers, this case may signal the need for clearer legislative standards rather than relying on judicial exceptions that evolve unevenly. And for the courts, the issue is far from settled. Similar cases are already moving through other circuits, and it's likely that the Supreme Court will eventually be forced to address the conflict directly when a cleaner procedural case reaches them. Until then, this denial stands as a reminder of something fundamental about the legal system. Constitutional rights are not only shaped by what courts say, but sometimes by what they choose not to say. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss future updates on cases that directly affect constitutional rights and due process. And as always, stay informed, because understanding the law is the first step to protecting your rights.